You may wonder, how does Buddhist practice work, really? And why is there all this interest in suffering, or dukkha, as it's called in Pali? I'm going to try to answer those questions today. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, a lot of us, I think, are interested in the question of how all of this is supposed to work, and why is there all this apparent interest in the suffering of humanity and our own suffering. It may seem kind of a downer. Today's video. It comes from a question that I got a little while ago from Brian Matthews. And he says that he likes Buddhist psychology a lot, but he says oftentimes there's a lot of talk about the nature of suffering, but a lack of an antidote. He says, I can listen to teachers talk for 90 minutes about why we suffer, and then spend 2 minutes talking about how to overcome it, but it's always vague and unhelpful. And Brian says that he finds himself in a cycle of bad decisions, bad mindsets, and he's trying to find a way out of it and trying to find some solutions here and wondering how this is all supposed to work. Now, of course, to begin with, there are many, many ways that the Buddhist practice can work for you. So I'm going to discuss out of my own experience as well as some knowledge of the early Buddhist texts. But as in all these cases, your mileage may vary. So just take this as one option or one way of understanding things. And I think what Brian points to is a very real concern that some of us may have, and indeed that some of us do have, about the way that things are sometimes portrayed in Buddhism. That there seems to be this emphasis on suffering, on dukkha. So, dukkha is an odd word within Pali, in the language that's early Buddhism is translated from. I would prefer a translation more like unsatisfactoriness. It's just the way that life isn't completely satisfactory to us. But, as Brian says, we have our own problems in our own lives. We're caught up in, let's say, poor decisions and difficulties. And so it can seem kind of a downer or an added downer to spend time actually thinking about those things when we're face to face with them all the time. So it seems like there are two questions here. The first question is, why is there all this emphasis on suffering? And the second question is, what do we actually do about the suffering? The suffering that we actually do feel in our lives. What is the actual way we're supposed to take forward? How is that supposed to work, and what are we supposed to do? And what I'm going to suggest in this video is that maybe paradoxically, interestingly, the answer to both questions is the same. Now, if we indeed begin with one of the deepest parts of the Buddha's teaching, the Four Noble Truths. The first of these Noble Truths, some of us will have heard translated as life is suffering. It's the truth of suffering, or the truth of the unsatisfactory nature of the world. There's another way to understand these truths, is to understand them as tasks, as things that must be done. And indeed, the Buddha describes them as tasks in his first sermon, in his supposed first sermon. And in that first sermon, what he says is that suffering is to be fully understood. So that is our first task along the path, is to try to fully understand suffering. Or, if you like, to fully understand the unsatisfactory nature of reality. To come to know that directly in all aspects of our life. And the second one of these tasks involves knowing where that suffering or that unsatisfactoriness comes from. To know that it comes from craving. We have certain cravings that cannot be completely fulfilled. And that impossibility of fulfilling craving makes life unsatisfactory. Because we're always striving for things that can't be attained. And so the second one of these tasks is to give up that craving, to relax around that craving. We might say to release craving. And the question is how to release craving. And once again, perhaps paradoxically, I don't believe that craving is the sort of thing that we can release, that we can decide to just give up. I think if you try that, you'll see that it doesn't work, that craving simply comes back. Craving is the sort of thing that you cannot will to give up. If we could, we would all be awakened already. So there's a problem here. In my experience, the only way to truly release craving is to practice in such a way that the craving releases itself. And that may seem a surprise to you. The question then becomes, how do we practice such that craving releases itself? Well, the way that we do that is by coming to a greater, more incisive knowledge and awareness of the objects of craving. To begin to understand that those objects really are not all they're cracked up to be, that they're not as crave-worthy as we originally thought, as we ordinarily think. And when we come to see that, when we come to see that the objects of craving really aren't so hot after all, then the craving dries up on its own. When we see that the objects of our desire or craving are themselves unsatisfactory, then we begin to, the craving itself begins to dry up. That is to say, that if we practice by getting to know unsatisfactoriness, by getting to know suffering directly, then paradoxically, suffering dries up. But we have to do it in a particular way, because there's a right way, if you like, a right way and a wrong way to approach suffering, to approach unsatisfactoriness. In particular, the way that we ordinarily approach suffering or unsatisfactoriness is to feel sorry for ourselves, is to sort of wallow in the suffering. And that approach is an approach of really clinging to it in a way, of identifying with the suffering, of thinking of the suffering as mine, as who I am, as part of my being. And we bridle against that, and so we struggle with it. That, of course, again, that's normally how we approach suffering, and when we're told within a Buddhist context to get to know suffering, we're thinking, oh, so I have to do that, I've got to sort of wallow in it. And that is not a helpful approach. Rather, we have to come to see suffering not as who I am, not as something that's mine, not as feeling sorry for ourselves, but rather simply part of the furniture of the world, as something that is part of the way things are when the mind works in a certain way. In particular, in a formal meditation, we can see unsatisfactoriness or suffering arise within our experiences, within our senses, our feeling, our hearing, seeing, if you like, if you're doing meditation with your eyes open, all of our senses. We can see it arise, we can see it decay in certain circumstances when we release around craving, when craving goes away. We can see this arise, rising and falling, as part of the furniture of the world. And as we see this, we'll generally find that craving begins to decline somewhat, because the objects of craving are seen for what they really are, which is something which are things that are not really worth craving. And as we see that, we also begin to see the route towards the extinction of craving, because we're beginning to understand and see directly the way that the process of Buddhist practice works. We begin to see that route towards the extinction of suffering, which is, of course, a far goal. It's not something that most of us will expect to achieve anytime soon, if at all, but even small differences can make a big difference in time. Now, I've done an earlier video actually on the Four Noble Truths seen as tasks, which is an idea that came out of, well, a paper that I wrote with my friend Justin Whitaker, talking about that first sermon, but also Stephen Batchelor has written very eloquently about it as well. I'll put a link to that video up on the screen here. Take a look at it. Thanks so much to all of you. Thanks to all of the supporters on Patreon. If you're getting something out of these videos, take a look over at our Patreon page. It's linked down below. Thanks so much.